I can't remember a time when I wasn't fascinated by animals. I was the child that was out there in the dirt looking for earthworms and beetles and lots of these creepy crawlies. I even had a doll's house, which was an open zoo where I tried to collect all these animals from the outside. I wanted to climb up the tree and see the bird's eye view of the world. The world of animals absolutely fascinated me. And like all children, I had so many questions. Why doesn't a spider get wrapped up in its own web? How do birds know where to migrate to all the way from our country to Africa in the summer? I wanted to know all the answers to these questions. It was really my love of animals that led me on to want to become a vet. And up until then, I hadn't been really that interested in people. But it was through my work as a vet and really seeing that relationship between people and the animals, whether or not it was an old lady and her dog that connected her to local communities and to other people, or whether or not it was a farmer and how he looked after his cows and how he looked after the wildlife, putting bird boxes up for the birds, creating wildlife ponds, that I suddenly began to realise that humans and animals are ultimately connected. And I not only became fascinated by the animals, but also by the stories that I was hearing about people's connection with the wild world. And that's really what inspired me to write the stories, not only about animals, but about people too. In the story of Run Wild, Asher and Izzy find a wolf in wasteland in the middle of the city. Now I've got the skull of a wolf right here. It's very similar to the skull of a domestic dog, but there are differences. You can see this is a skull of a very powerful wild creature. You can see by its teeth and also the size of its jaw and where the muscles, the crunching, munching muscles attach from the jawbone up to the skull. This is a wild creature, and a wolf can never truly be domesticated. I wanted to write about the wolf because a wolf is a very much emblem of the wild. And in fact, wolves used to live in Britain over 300 years ago. But they were heavily persecuted. They were shot and killed, not only in this country, but also across Europe. But over the recent decades, wolves have been coming back to France and to Spain and to the Netherlands, to many places in Europe. But we don't have any wolves in Britain. And it's a big question, should we have wolves up in Scotland? Should we be able to see them sliding through the shadows? Or should we be able to hear their wild howl at night? And I think we should, because bringing wolves back into the wild will not only rewild our landscape, but it will help rewild our own selves too. Wildness is a theme that runs through the whole story of Run Wild. Izzy and Asher find this special place, this hidden wilderness within the city. And for them it's so important because it's a space that they can be away from the troubles of home and school lives. It's a place they can feel truly free. And when we talk about being in the wilderness or being in the wild, many people think of it as a remote place in some faraway jungle or on some high mountain. But like Asher and Izzy, we can find wildness all around us. And it's really important too. It's not just important for the wildlife. Being in the wild is important for us as people. And I find the wild in the city, just perhaps sometimes watching a peregrine in a high-speed chase, chasing a pigeon across the skyline, or just sitting beneath trees having time to think and dream with the changing patterns of light. It's also a place where you can just experience amazing wonders. A dolphin bursts up from the bow-ways if you're on a boat ride. The wild can be that time when your heart quickens and all your senses are heightened, such as if you go and watch at night and go and watch badgers in their set and wait for them to come out. And for me, the wild is also a place where you can really challenge yourself in the elements, whether or not you're walking up a mountain or you're sailing, you're kayaking down a river. I think the wild is a place where we can really connect with nature. It's a place where we can really feel free and really truly feel alive. The emotional bond between children and animals is so important, and I've seen it actually in my own children. When they were very little, when they were toddlers, we bought our first puppy, Sam, who was this black Labrador, and Sam grew up with them, and Sam would climb in a cardboard box which became a rocket ship to the moon. They'd travel and explore the moon. They would sit in Sam's bed and read books to him. And as they were growing up, as they became teenagers, they would come back and sit with him and cry into his shoulder, telling him all their troubles. And Sam became this guardian for them, and they really sort of loved him and relied on him. And he gave them what lots of animals do give to us, which is this unconditional love and friendship. And in doing that, Sam gave my children so much more, because he gave them the ability to really sort of understand how to look after an animal, how to care for the animal. And it was a bond. Sadly, Sam's no longer with us, but he'll forever be in their hearts. They'll always remember him, and it's this bond between them and an animal which they'll never forget. And that's so true for so many people with their pets. And also there's also a bond between people and wild animals, and the habitats and the environments in which they live too. The emotional connection between people and animals is so important, and I think it's something which is often overlooked. And I remember a true story which was told to me about a boy, and this boy was really the inspiration for Scott in Run Wild. Scott is a troubled boy, and as quite often happens, people put labels on some troubled children, their trouble, and it's very hard to remove those labels without understanding why somebody has had a troubled life. And so this true story was about a boy who had these labels put upon him, and one day he was out in the woods by himself. He didn't want to go home. He had quite a troubled home, and he came across this injured dog that was lost in the woods. And he had a real connection with this dog, and he lifted it up and took it home. And then he found out that this old man had lost his dog, was looking for his dog, and he returned the dog to the old man. And it was through that connection, when he sat chatting to the old man, that the old man listened to this boy. He was the first person who just sat and listened and took time to understand. And together, through that dog, this man turned the boy's life around. And so it's just so important, these connections that happen between people and animals. One of the most uplifting experiences that I've had recently was to join the People's March for Wildlife in London. It was a march of 10,000 people, starting in Hyde Park and walking all the way to Downing Street, and all these people brought together by their love and concern for wildlife and wild places. There were all sorts there. There were families there, small children, older people from the older generation. Everybody brought together to try to call for changes to happen to help protect our wildlife and our wild places. There's no doubt that wildlife is in trouble all across the world. We're finding the biggest problems are habitat loss, there's illegal wildlife crime, there's pollution, and of course there's climate change. And here in the UK, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. In just the past 50 years, over 60% of our wildlife has declined dramatically. And that's in my lifetime, and that scares me a lot. It can feel very daunting with how do we reverse these changes. And we can campaign for wildlife, we can ask our MPs and our politicians for change, but actually we can also change things right here, right now, because many of us have got access to some form of outside space. It could be a balcony, it could be a small garden, it could be a big garden, it could be a school grounds, it could be a park. But all these areas can be rewilded. We can let the wild come back to them. And when we think about it, we've got over 400,000 hectares of gardens across the UK. So just imagine if we let the wild come back to a little bit of each garden, if we put log piles and made ponds, and if we let the weeds grow and the shrubs grow so we could provide shelter for birds in the winter, so we could provide nesting places, we could really let the wild come back, and we'd have this huge network and patchwork of the wild all across the country. And that would have a huge impact. We could ditch the weed killers and the pesticides. We could let the wildlife just flourish in all its glorious form, and it would be amazing then to see hedgehogs coming back into our gardens. We could see slowworms in our compost bins. We could see a sparrowhawk flying across in chase of a blackbird. It would be an amazing place. And the problem sometimes is with the adults. Adults have this obsessive need for tidiness and neatness, to trim the borders, to pull up the weeds, to have a nice neat lawn. Well, we want to do away with all of that. We need to do away with neatness and tidiness because it isn't wildlife friendly. We need to have areas where the weeds really grow, where you can build a den. We can hide it off from the rest of the house or the garden, where you can just sit in the den and read stories. If you've got room, have a campfire. Just have a really wild space for your own self and to see all the animals and plants. In the story Run Wild, Asher and Izzy find this wildlife haven in this old disused industrial site. The wildlife has gone rampant, the weeds have grown everywhere, animals and birds have gone back, there's a myriad of insects. It's a beautiful place, but it's under threat from developers who want to wipe it down, they want to fill it with concrete. And Asher and Izzy realise that this is a magical place and they want to save it from the developers, but they're only children. How can they persuade people to save this wildlife against the encroachment of all the buildings? When I was growing up, I struggled with reading. And I could see lots of other children progressing along the reading schemes, and I was stuck, really. I was stuck on some of the long words and books without pictures. They scared me. But one of the books which really introduced me to the world of stories and got me hooked on books was this. This is one of my favourite books. It is Tintin in Tibet. And what I loved about the Tintin stories is that they were really great stories, but they were told through pictures. So you could follow these wonderful pictures, and there are a few words to follow, and great adventures. So that was Tintin in Tibet was one of my favourite stories. One of my favourite stories as a child was this book. It's a very old book, as you can see. Its cover is cloth bound, and it's got this picture of a goose on the front. And it's called The Snow Goose by Paul Gallico. Now, as a child who struggled with reading, I picked this book up because the first thing that I loved to see was this picture of this girl. This is Fritha, and she's holding this wild goose. And when I picked up the book, I just suddenly wanted to be Fritha. I wanted to be that girl finding that injured bird and finding out about the story. So many of the pictures in the story really spoke to me because I was also a struggling reader, so I really needed the pictures to access the words. And this is one of the pictures that I absolutely loved. It's the bird, the snow goose, flying free. And I think it's so important these days that children do find the story that speaks to them, because once you find that story, then your reading will fly. When I was growing up, there was one book which was my absolute favourite, and it was a non-fiction book. It was my Bible. It was my way into the natural world, and it was this book. You can see how much I loved it because of all, it's so ragged and worn. It's The Living World of Animals. And what I loved about it so much was that it showed me the whole animal kingdom, how it was classified. And then it separated the animals into their habitats, whether or not it was across the oceans or arid deserts or grasslands or jungles. It brought the whole wild world into my bedroom. And that is why I loved it so much as a child. Having access to wild space is really important. And when I was growing up, I grew up on the edge of a city. We had a really long garden, which very steep, which went all the way down to this scrubby woodland, which is owned by the council. And that's where I went to play with my friends. We went on sort of amazing adventures in this tiny bit of woodland. We'd climb trees, we'd watch out for the foxes that ran through this area, we'd make mud pies, we'd make dens. It was just a place to be far away from adults, just to be ourselves. But sadly, that woodland has now been concreted over. There are houses there now. And I do wonder, where do those children who live in those houses, where do they play? Where's their wild space? And all over the country, these small pockets of wild space are just disappearing, being covered up with housing or development. And I think we really need to protect wild space.